What if everything you thought you knew about the Mali Empire was incomplete? We picture it as a land of gold, mighty kings, and Mansa Musa's legendary wealth. But buried beneath those glittering stories are fragments that hint at something historians rarely discuss: a secret about intimacy, power, and forbidden bonds in West Africa's greatest empire. Did rulers keep male companions closer than court scribes would admit? Were warriors tied by bonds that went beyond brotherhood? Or are we simply misreading the songs, the poems, and the travelers' shocked reports? You're about to enter a chapter of African history that was almost erased, but not quite. Before we dive in, drop a comment with the time you're watching this morning. Midnight doesn't matter, we see you. And if you love uncovering the stories most channels avoid, consider subscribing. No pressure. But here, we ask the questions others won't. Ready to step inside the shadows of Mali? Let's begin. You're about to step into a royal courtyard where whispers travel faster than drummers on festival day. Because here, the juiciest stories aren't about trade or battles, but about who's holding whose hand when no one is supposed to notice. Imagine standing under the carved arches of a palace in the Mali Empire centuries ago, with the sound of courtiers' sandals sliding over stone. The empire looks invincible on the outside: gold caravans, learned scholars, glittering mosques. But behind the walls, it's a human story of power, closeness, and the very real possibility that the man walking behind the king is more than just a guard. The empire's palaces, especially in capitals like Niani, were alive with young attendants. They were called by many names: pages, guards, companions, but really, they were the background cast to royal spectacle. And when people spend long hours together, sharing meals, guarding doors, or standing shoulder to shoulder through ceremonies, emotional bonds form. Some of these bonds turned into something tender, even romantic. Is that so surprising? Put any group of people in an enclosed environment, say your modern office cubicle or a military barracks, and sparks eventually fly. The palace wasn't any different, only with a lot more gold and a stricter rulebook. Islam, which had spread deeply into Mali's ruling class by the 14th century, officially frowned upon same-sex relations. But history is always messier than official rules. Courtiers whispered about men who favored the company of other men, and there are traces in chronicles and oral histories that such attachments were noticed. Some attendants were promoted not only for their loyalty, but also because of personal affection. Would a king risk scandal for companionship? Sometimes yes, because even rulers wrapped in layers of ritual sought comfort in ways no sermon could erase. Picture the scene: torches throwing light across mud brick walls, griots singing praise poetry, and in the shadows, a guard leaning a little closer than necessary toward his lord. It doesn't take much imagination to see that human longing ignored the official script. You can almost hear the hushed giggles of servants who noticed, because palace staff were like today's office gossip mill, except without smartphones to spread the news. The walls had ears, and those ears remembered. Take Mansa Musa, the most famous of Mali's emperors. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 became legend. So much gold poured into Cairo that the economy there wobbled. Chroniclers focused on his wealth and piety. But think about this: the caravan he led was massive, with hundreds of attendants. Among them were young men chosen not just for strength, but for their closeness to him. Historians rarely spell out what that closeness looked like in private, but silence in history is often its own form of confession. After all, if nothing unusual ever happened, why would sources feel the need to emphasize Musa's public devotion so strongly? There's also the question of hierarchy. In a court where women's movements were often restricted, young male attendants became the constant company for nobles. They guarded, entertained, even massaged tired feet after long days of court rituals. If intimacy developed, who would stop it? Only the very brave or very foolish would call out a king's favorite. And let's be honest, power tends to protect desire no matter what religious rules say. Think of celebrities today whose entourages travel everywhere with them. Sometimes those entourages are about security. Sometimes they're about companionship that runs deeper than friendship. Of course, secrecy was everything. In the empire, being accused of violating Islamic morality could ruin reputations. So those who indulged in such relationships cloaked them under the veil of loyalty and service. A man wasn't simply his ruler's lover. He was the most trusted guard, the closest companion, the one who never left his side. Euphemisms did the heavy lifting. Isn't it funny how language often hides more than it reveals? We still do it today, with phrases like just really good friends. Court life itself almost encouraged these hidden bonds. Imagine endless ceremonies, processions, and banquets where attendants stood for hours behind their masters. The slow grind of formality left plenty of room for private eye contact, whispered jokes, and the kind of shared endurance that builds closeness. One historian noted that palace staff often formed tight-knit brotherhoods. Within those circles, affection could grow without needing a label. Do you think anyone back then was worrying about hashtags or identity categories? No. They were just trying to live and love in the spaces carved out by circumstance. When foreign travelers like Ibn Battuta visited Mali in the 14th century, they often judged what they saw through their own cultural lens. Ibn Battuta himself wrote critically about local customs, especially anything he thought strayed from strict Islam. Yet his writings sometimes reveal more than he intended. He noticed the warmth and openness with which men interacted, gestures, greetings, even sleeping arrangements that seemed intimate by his standards. He condemned it, but condemnation often points to what was actually happening on the ground. Isn't that the historian's trick? Reading between the lines of outrage to glimpse everyday reality. And so, in the Mali Empire's courtly halls, whispers about who favored whom floated like incense smoke, thick, lingering, and impossible to pin down. The empire's grandeur may dominate textbooks, but if you lean closer, you hear softer stories about men in power and the bonds they shared when no one was supposed to be looking. Step out of the palace walls and into the marketplace, because that's where the city really breathes. You're shoulder to shoulder with traders from across the Sahara camel bells, jangling spices tickling your nose, and the clamor of bargaining filling your ears. But not everything here is about salt gold or cola nuts. After dark, when the torches burn low and the watchmen grow tired, the market becomes a stage for a different kind of exchange. Fleeting encounters happen in shadows, between stalls, where the buzz of trade fades into whispers of curiosity and desire. Markets were Mali's crossroads. You could find Tuareg merchants wrapped in indigo veils, Mandinka farmers selling grain, and Songhai fishermen hawking dried catch. People traveled far, slept in makeshift quarters, and mingled with strangers they might never meet again. And you know what happens when travelers gather? Stories are swapped, laughter bursts out, and sometimes glances linger longer than the coins being counted. A marketplace is more than economics. It's human energy compressed into one spot. If you've ever walked through a crowded night market today, say in Bangkok or Marrakesh, you know that feeling of possibility. Back then, that same possibility extended beyond business deals. Men without families at their side, soldiers, sailors on the Niger camel drivers often looked for company to break the loneliness of the road. Some found it with women, others with men. It wasn't necessarily about identity or labels. It was about what was available in the moment, a way to soothe the ache of isolation. You can almost picture it, a soldier leaning against a stack of baskets, catching the eye of a craftsman cleaning up after the day's sales. No words needed, just a nod toward a quieter alley. If you're wondering whether people judge them, sure. Gossip always travels, but the anonymity of a market gave cover that palace walls never could. Nighttime in Timbuktu or Gao carried its own soundtrack. Drums from distant quarters, laughter of those who'd had too much millet beer, the occasional bray of donkeys. In that mix, secret meetings blended seamlessly. The thing about marketplaces is they're built for hiding in plain sight. Everyone's too busy minding their goods or arguing about prices to notice two men stepping away into the shadows. Isn't it true even today? In the busiest places, privacy exists in plain view because no one is paying attention. Some sources hint at punishments for same-sex intimacy, but context matters. Laws often looked strict on paper, but were softer in practice. Officials turned blind eyes if the individuals weren't causing trouble or scandal. After all, the empire relied on smooth trade more than moral policing. A happy merchant was better for business than a scandalized one. And if soldiers on patrol found comfort where they could, who was going to lecture them? It's not as though barracks life offered cozy romance novels. What's fascinating is how coded behaviors developed. People used gestures, phrases, or meeting spots to signal interest. Picture it like a secret handshake, subtle enough not to raise suspicion, but clear enough to those in the know. Historians suspect some of these signals were tied to particular inns or riverbank areas. Think of modern nightlife. Certain corners of a city gain reputations known quietly within communities, but unmarked on official maps. Mali's marketplaces had their equivalents. We also can't ignore the role of music and dance. Markets often turned into impromptu festivals. Drummers played dancers, leapt, and the crowd swayed with excitement. In that haze, boundaries loosened. A hand brushed another's shoulder. A laugh lingered too long, and suddenly, two strangers shared a connection. Have you ever noticed how music dissolves barriers? The same was true here centuries ago. Interestingly, not all encounters were casual. Some led to bonds that lasted for journeys across the Sahara. Caravans were long, exhausting, and dangerous. Companions, who began as fleeting partners, sometimes became travel partners, looking after each other when sandstorms hit or when bandits prowled. Oral histories occasionally mention friendships between men that seemed unusually close, marked by loyalty and sacrifice. The sources don't always spell out intimacy, but you can read between the lines. Why else would one merchant risk his life for another outside his own kin? And yes, there were risks. A wrong word in the wrong ear could mean humiliation. Some clerics scolded openly, reminding townspeople of religious law. Yet the very fact that sermons kept repeating the warnings suggests the practice never really stopped. It's like when parents keep telling teenagers not to text at dinner, you only repeat what you know is happening. So as you drift through the Mali Empire's markets, you realize they weren't just centers of gold and salt. They were also places where men carved out moments of connection under the cover of trade. The empire's economy thrived in the daylight, but under the stars, its people found ways to satisfy the quieter economies of the heart. You step away from the market's chatter and into the hush of a scholar's chamber, where parchment and ink tell quieter stories than the drums outside. Picture the walls lined with manuscripts in careful Arabic script, some imported across the desert, others copied by hand in Timbuktu's famous libraries. These texts don't announce their secrets outright, but if you lean close, you start noticing little turns of phrase, metaphors of longing, allegories of beauty that suggest more than just theological debates. Scholars had to be clever. To write openly about affection between men would invite trouble, but to couch it in poetry or coded commentary was another matter entirely. Think about how people today use song lyrics or memes to say what they can't say outright. In 14th century Mali poetry played the same role. Verses about the beloved youth, or the friend whose eyes shine brighter than the moon, could be dismissed as spiritual metaphors, but to those listening with sharper ears, the undertone was clear. If the beloved is always described as smooth-cheeked and graceful, what kind of beloved do you think that was? Right, it didn't always mean a woman. This wasn't unique to Mali. Across the Islamic world, poetry flourished with homoerotic imagery. Andalusian poets, Persian writers, even scholars in Cairo crafted verses that blended divine yearning with very earthly admiration. Mali's scholars, trading ideas along the same caravan routes that carried salt and gold, absorbed these influences. Timbuktu, after all, was not an isolated outpost. It was plugged into a buzzing network of intellectual exchange. So while jurists wrote strict laws in one column, poets slipped in lines of love in another. Isn't it fascinating how culture always finds loopholes? One striking example comes from the commentary traditions. Scholars often quoted earlier works from North Africa or the Middle East that spoke of youthful beauty in vague, glowing terms. In copying and teaching these texts, Mali's intellectuals preserved not just theology, but also the shadows of forbidden affection. Imagine a student sitting cross-legged in a madrasa, reciting lines about the beloved who guides the heart. On the surface, it's devotional, but what if his eyes flickered toward his classmate while reciting? Suddenly, the text takes on a very human layer. The power of codes can't be overstated. A verse could mean one thing to the uninitiated and something entirely different to those in the circle. This is survival through language. You see the same today in communities, under pressure slang, inside jokes, subtle emojis that communicate belonging, while outsiders miss the point. For Mali's scholars, allegory was the safest shield. A manuscript praising the beauty of the gazelle-eyed friend wasn't going to be banned outright, because gazelles are just animals, right? But for those who felt the tug of such verses, the meaning was crystal clear. And don't think these texts were only dusty relics. Students copied them again and again. Some manuscripts still survive today in Timbuktu's private collections, smuggled through wars, and hidden from colonial plunder. They're reminders that love and desire were never fully erased, only tucked away between the lines. Have you ever stumbled across an old diary or a scribbled note in the margin of a book? That's the feeling here, an echo of lives lived half in shadow, half in ink. Of course, not all scholars approved. There were debates sometimes heated about morality and law. Preachers scolded judges, threatened punishment, and yet the poetry kept flowing. Because desire doesn't vanish just because a law says so. It adapts, it hides, it laughs behind metaphor. If anything, the repression sharpened the creativity. Some of the most beautiful verses in Islamic tradition, still quoted in classrooms today, carry that double edge of devotion and longing. Mali's thinkers were part of that tradition, and their words carried across generations. Now imagine the rhythm of daily study. Candles flicker, students murmur their lessons, and a teacher unrolls a manuscript filled with calligraphy. He points out the commentary, the layers of meaning. One student blushes, another smirks, knowingly. It's not unlike when a modern teacher explains Shakespeare's sonnets, half the class nods along politely, while the other half notices the cheeky undertones. History's classrooms weren't so different. So when you think of the Mali Empire, don't just imagine gold-laden caravans. Picture scholars, hunched over ink-stained pages, crafting lines that balanced on the edge between faith and forbidden affection. The empire's manuscripts weren't just intellectual treasures. They were also safe houses for coded love, preserved in metaphors that still whisper if you're willing to listen. Justice in the Mali Empire could drag into the open something as private as whom you shared a bedroll with. One moment you're blending into the crowd, the next you're watching a man hauled before a Qadi, accused not of theft or rebellion, but of affection, whispered in the wrong place. The sun beats down the square swells with murmurs, and suddenly the whole community is caught up in a trial where law, gossip, and morality collide like cymbals at a festival. Trials here weren't just legal affairs. They were theater-staged reminders that power could reach even into your most secret moments. When Islam became deeply rooted in Mali's ruling class, Qadi's judges trained in Islamic law were appointed to hear cases. Their job wasn't easy. On one hand, scripture was clear about prohibitions. On the other hand, the empire's prosperity depended on harmony. A harsh ruling could spark unrest or break valuable networks of trust. So what did they do? They improvised. Sometimes punishments were symbolic rather than severe public shaming fines or short periods of confinement. You might say they walked a tightrope balancing fear of God with the practicalities of empire. Take the case of accusations themselves. They often came from rival families, jealous colleagues, or personal enemies. Imagine two merchants competing in the same market. One whispers to the judge that the other has been too friendly with his young apprentice. Suddenly, morality is weaponized as business strategy. Doesn't that feel eerily familiar? Even today, people sometimes use rumor or accusation to pull down rivals, hiding ambition behind a cloak of virtue. The punishments described in chronicles were rarely carried out to the letter. Severe penalties like death were uncommon because they disrupted the workforce and frightened the community. Instead, trials served as warning signals. Public sermons followed reminding people of religious law. The real punishment was often social whispers, broken alliances, reputations quietly ruined. And reputational damage in a tightly woven empire could sting worse than any whip. Have you ever noticed how gossip travels faster than official news? The same rule applied then, yet there's an irony here. The very existence of repeated trials and sermons proves that these behaviors never went away. If same-sex intimacy had been rare, why would clerics keep warning about it? You don't lecture endlessly about something nobody's doing. It's like shouting, "Don't eat sugar," at a group of monks living off roots and herbs. The repetition shows that behind closed doors, life carried on as it always had. Picture the scene of a trial. A Kadi sits on a low bench, scribes ready with ink, witnesses fidgeting. The accused stands silent, perhaps terrified, perhaps defiant. The crowd buzzes, half curious, half nervous. A griot might even be nearby, ready to record the outcome into oral memory. These trials weren't private, they were public spectacles. And in that spectacle, fear and fascination mixed. People leaned in whispering, "Who's guilty this time? Whose secrets are now open for everyone to see?" Some trials were hushed up quickly, especially if they involved men of influence. A powerful noble might confess privately, offer a donation to the mosque, and walk away with his standing intact. Others weren't so lucky. Servants, guards, or travelers without protection bore the brunt of judgment. That double standard tells you everything. Power bent the rules. If you were useful to the empire, your mistakes were forgiven. If you were expendable, morality came crashing down on your head. History is full of such hypocrisies, isn't it? Foreign observers sometimes reported these trials with a mix of shock and fascination. Ibn Battuta, for instance, criticized what he saw as lax enforcement. To him, punishments seemed too soft proof that Mali wasn't following Islam strictly enough. But what he missed was the pragmatism at play. The empire wasn't a monastery. It was a vast, diverse state with many traditions. Enforcing law with rigidity could break it apart. Leaders understood that survival sometimes meant bending rules in practice while preaching them in principle. Think of how modern governments handle controversial issues: stern speeches, symbolic fines, but rarely full enforcement. The Mali Empire invented that balancing act centuries ago. Trials about sexuality weren't just about individuals. They were about reminding the community of boundaries while quietly allowing life to go on. A system of smoke and mirrors, really enough punishment to look serious enough leniency to keep the wheels turning. So in the heat of the square, as the accused lowers his head and the Cadi delivers judgment, you see the contradictions of empire laid bare. The law thundered from pulpits, but in practice, it bent like a reed in the Niger's wind. Step back from the noise of trials and punishments and slip into the quieter corners where survival meant subtlety. Not every story of queer life in the Mali Empire unfolded in courts or palaces. Most happened in silence, hidden gestures, knowing looks, and safe spaces carved out of ordinary routines. You can almost imagine two men working side by side in a workshop, their conversation harmless on the surface, but a shared phrase or playful nudge carrying more meaning than any onlooker would guess. Networks existed, though not the kind you'd find in official records. These were webs of trust, built through repetition, the same stall visited week after week, the same path walked home at night, the same corner of the riverbank, where a familiar face always appeared. Trust was currency. In a world where an accusation could ruin you, only those who proved their loyalty again and again were welcomed into these private circles. If you've ever belonged to a tight-knit club or hobby group where everyone recognizes each other instantly, you know the feeling. Only here, the stakes were far higher. Secrecy had its own vocabulary. Historians suggest that certain jokes, handshakes, or even song lyrics served as quiet signals. Think of how modern communities under pressure develop inside jokes or coded emojis. In Mali, it could be a greeting held just a beat too long, or a proverb dropped into conversation that only the right ear would catch. Outsiders heard nothing unusual. Insiders heard everything. Isn't it remarkable how human beings find ways to communicate what cannot be spoken. And then there were the physical spaces. Inns near caravan stops shaded courtyards, even specific corners of mosques after prayers became meeting points. Not officially, of course, but word spread discreetly about which spots offered safety. You might compare it to knowing which cafe in your city has that unspoken reputation, a place where people with shared secrets somehow find one another. Mali's towns had their equivalents, though they left no neon signs, only memories whispered across generations. Some of these networks stretched surprisingly wide. Caravans carried more than salt and gold, they carried knowledge of where to find companionship across vast distances. A traveler leaving Gao might know where to stop in Timbuktu, which innkeeper turned a blind eye, which quarter of the city allowed for a measure of privacy. The Niger River itself acted like a thread connecting communities that learned how to survive in silence together. But survival was never just about pleasure. It was about resilience. To live with desire that official law condemned meant mastering caution, reading people's moods, and knowing when to retreat. Imagine the skill it took to maintain a facade day after day, all while keeping alive a hidden self. Isn't that a kind of bravery, too? Not the bravery sung about in battle epics, but the quiet courage of carving out a life in small stolen fragments. Occasionally, stories of extraordinary loyalty broke through the silence. Oral traditions recall friendships so deep that companions were buried side by side, their bond explained away as brotherhood. But who's to say what brotherhood meant in those cases? Language gave cover, but emotion seeped through. If you've ever seen a grave inscription that makes you pause, wondering about the untold story behind it, you'll understand how these silences still speak. Of course, not everyone navigated this hidden world successfully. Rumors slipped, betrayals happened, and sometimes authorities cracked down harder than usual. That risk never went away. Yet the networks endured, adapting like vines around stone walls, bending, twisting, finding new cracks to grow through. And so behind the empire's grand mosques and royal decrees, ordinary people built lives of quiet connection. No monuments record them, no chronicles praise them, but they endured. Just as gold dust sparkled unseen at the bottom of riverbeds, their stories shimmered beneath the surface, waiting for patient eyes to notice. Now shift your feet back into the sunlight, because you're standing in Timbuktu at the height of the empire, and the city feels like a living kaleidoscope. Caravans pour in from the desert, with camels swaying under bundles of salt. Scholars shuffle between madrasas, with scrolls tucked under their arms. And traders shout over piles of copper, ivory, and grain. The Mali Empire at its peak wasn't just wealthy, it was dazzling, the kind of place that made foreign visitors rub their eyes and wonder if they'd stumbled into a dream made of gold dust. The wealth was real. Remember, Mansa Musa, the emperor whose pilgrimage to Mecca shook the medieval economy. His generosity was legendary, but it wasn't magic. It was built on a carefully organized system of trade routes that tied the Sahara to the Mediterranean. Salt from the mines of Tahaza, gold from Bambouk and Bure, slaves, from raids on rival territories, and manuscripts from North Africa, all converged here. If you ever felt overwhelmed at a modern airport with people rushing in every direction, that's the energy you'd sense walking through Timbuktu at its busiest. With that kind of bustle came a blend of cultures. Berber traders from the north, Yoruba merchants from the east, Fulani herders moving cattle along the rivers they all passed through. And each brought not only goods, but also habits, music, and stories. Diversity was the empire's heartbeat, though it also created tensions. People disagreed on customs, but the sheer wealth pouring into the empire kept disagreements manageable. After all, it's hard to argue when everyone is busy counting coins. What's striking, though, is how ordinary life went on underneath the grandeur. Imagine children splashing in the Niger's shallow waters, women pounding millet with rhythmic thuds of pestles, craftsmen hammering gold into jewelry. To outsiders, Mali was a shimmering empire of gold. To locals, it was also chores, errands, and gossip. Isn't that always the case? Tourists see the postcard view. Residents see the laundry line. Empire's scholars gave it an intellectual glow that matched its economic shine. Timbuktu's Sankore University drew students from across West Africa. They came for theology, astronomy, medicine, and law. But they also came to join the buzzing debates that spilled into courtyards long after lectures ended. The image of Timbuktu as a city of books wasn't exaggerated. By the 16th century, its private libraries rivaled anything in Europe. Picture dusty manuscripts stacked on shelves, ink-still dark pages smelling faintly of leather and desert air. That's the smell of knowledge preserved against time. But don't be fooled into thinking the city was only solemn scholarship. There were musicians playing choras in the evenings, griots weaving stories so vivid you felt pulled inside them, and markets overflowing with chatter. Wealth and knowledge made the empire's cities vibrant, but they also made them human, messy, noisy, filled with both brilliance and boredom. If you've ever walked through a modern university town, where professors debate philosophy in cafes while students rush off to part-time jobs, you'll recognize the same blend. Still, prosperity had shadows. Enslavement of captured peoples underpinned much of the wealth. Caravans carried human beings as part of their cargo, and that reality sat alongside the empire's grandeur. Power and suffering were intertwined, as they so often are. Walking through the city, you'd see both the gleam of gold bracelets and the weary faces of laborers who built the walls. It's a reminder that history's shining centers often have dim edges. For those living with desires unspoken, like the men and women whose stories we've been tracing, the empire's height was both opportunity and danger. On one hand, crowded streets offered anonymity. On the other, the more prosperous and visible the empire became, the sharper the eyes of moral enforcers grew. In some ways, prosperity made discretion more urgent. Success magnifies scrutiny, doesn't it? When everyone is watching, hiding becomes an art. So as you wander Timbuktu's avenues, the empires might presses in on you from every side. Wealth glittering in markets, knowledge buzzing in schools, music floating through the night. The Mali Empire at its height was a place where the extraordinary and the ordinary coexisted, each shaping the other, in rhythms that still echo faintly if you listen closely enough. Gold and salt may have built the empire, but faith stitched it together. And here's the hook. Religion wasn't just about prayers in the mosque. It was a referee over people's most private desires. Picture yourself in a crowded Friday congregation, the imam's voice booming as he reminds the faithful of God's commands. You glance around and notice the crowd shifting uneasily, because sermons like these weren't abstract. Everyone knew the words were aimed at real people in their neighborhoods, maybe even friends who kept quiet smiles in public and different company after dark. Islam arrived in Mali through merchants and scholars long before it was enforced by rulers. By the time Mansa Musa took the throne, the faith was tightly bound to statecraft. Mosques rose beside markets, qadis handled disputes, and fasting during Ramadan became as much a civic rhythm as a religious duty. For rulers, Islam was both a source of legitimacy and a leash powerful enough to unite people, strict enough to keep behavior in check. But human nature never bows entirely to a sermon. That's where the cracks appear. Private life in the empire was always more complicated than official piety. A man could attend mosque, faithfully donate to scholars, and still slip into the company of companions in ways the imam would disapprove. Does that sound hypocritical, maybe? But it's also deeply human. Even today, people nod through rules they know they'll bend later. Religion and reality often danced an uneasy duet. This tension was sharpest in the courts. Judges tried to enforce Islamic law, but as you heard earlier, enforcement wobbled when it collided with pragmatism. Too much harshness risked disrupting trade. Too much leniency risked angering clerics. So rulers often played a double game, publicly pious, privately flexible. That double game shaped daily life. If you've ever had a boss who insists on rules in meetings but looks the other way when results matter, you'll recognize the pattern. Faith shaped gender roles too. Islamic teachings layered over older local traditions restricted women's visibility in public spaces. That restriction had an unintended side effect. Men often spent more time with men both in work and leisure. Companionship deepened in these all-male environments, guard units, scholarly circles, caravans. No imam could erase the fact that proximity breeds connection. Rules said one thing, daily life offered another. But faith wasn't only a cage. It also provided cover. Poetry framed longing as spiritual allegory. Scholars could praise beauty in a way that seemed devotional on the surface, but carried undertones that listeners decoded. Religion gave language for yearning, even when the law scolded it. Isn't it fascinating how people can take the very structure meant to limit them and twist it into a shield? There were also figures who embodied the contradictions. Griots, for example, sang praises to rulers while slyly hinting at the affections they knew, but dared not name directly. Clerics thundered in sermons, yet quietly counseled mercy in private. Power itself often dictated which face of religion appeared strict judge on Friday, forgiving confidant on Monday. Mali's rulers learned to bend religion into a tool for governing, but ordinary people learned to bend it into a tool for surviving. Foreign travelers noticed these contradictions. Some marveled at Mali's devotion, praising its mosques and scholars. Others, like Ibn Battuta, criticized what he saw as laxity, women uncovered in public, men too free in their friendships. His outrage, though, reveals what really happened. People lived faith in ways that didn't fit rigid boxes. The empire wasn't an idealized model. It was a society negotiating belief and desire in real time. So as you stand in that Friday crowd, listening to the imam's words roll like waves over bowed heads, you feel the tension humming beneath the surface. Faith and power entwine here, holy words on one side, whispered lives on the other. The empire moved forward by holding both even when they pulled in opposite directions. Before mosques rose above Mali's towns, other spirits ruled the landscape. Rivers carried their own guardians' trees, whispered with ancestors, and rituals blurred lines of identity long before judges wrote down prohibitions. You find yourself in a village clearing where drums pound into the night, smoke curls upward from a fire, and everyone gathers to watch as a medium sways in trance, embodying the spirit that has chosen him. His body takes on gestures that are coded as feminine, yet no one jeers. Instead, the crowd nods with respect because they see not a man pretending, but a vessel of the divine. These older traditions allowed space for expressions that later moral codes tried to erase. In oral tales preserved by griots, you sometimes hear of companions of the heart pairs of men whose loyalty mattered more than lineage or heirs. The language never shouts about romance, but the closeness lingers like a perfume in the story, too obvious to ignore, too sacred to condemn. Doesn't it feel familiar how cultures often keep truths just beneath the surface, waiting for sharp ears to notice? Spirit possession ceremonies were one of the clearest windows into this fluid world. A man might take on the voice movement and even clothing of a female spirit not as entertainment, but as holy duty. Villagers saw this as a bridge between worlds, proof that boundaries weren't fixed, but permeable. It reminds you of how even today, in many festivals worldwide, performers embody roles that blur gender to channel something beyond the ordinary. Mali's villages did this long before foreign clerics arrived to frown at it. And then there were the bonds forged in labor. Farmers often worked in age groups, eating, sleeping, and living together in cycles of planting and harvest. Hunters, too, formed pairs or bands whose loyalty was absolute. These partnerships sometimes grew into lifelong commitments. Later chroniclers tried to frame them as simple brotherhood, but the depth of devotion suggests a wider spectrum of feeling. If you've ever known two people so inseparable that everyone else stops trying to define them, you've glimpsed the same truth. Indigenous rituals also shaped attitudes toward the body. Dance drumming and masquerades blurred categories. Masks might represent spirits with both male and female traits, reminding audiences that the unseen world wasn't locked into rigid roles. Children grew up watching these performances, absorbing the idea that identity was more layered than the law later allowed. Culture taught one lesson. Religion, centuries later, tried to teach another. When Islam spread deeper into Mali, these older practices didn't vanish overnight. Some were hidden, some reinterpreted, others folded quietly into daily life. A sermon might thunder against improper behavior, but in the next village, a possession ritual would still play out under the stars. This double reality gave cover to those who lived differently, reminding them that not everyone saw their desires as scandal. The tension between old and new created a kind of cultural echo. Villagers might nod at a Quadi's judgment during the day, but whisper stories of spirit lovers by the fire at night. Such dual worlds let hidden lives continue, even when the Empire's official voice tried to silence them. Belief systems don't disappear when decrees are issued. They adapt, bend, and slip into memory until someone listens closely again. Centuries later, French administrators grumbled in reports about Islamic customs still practiced in rural Mali. They didn't realize they were glimpsing remnants of something far older than the empire itself, a worldview where love and identity weren't pinned down by rigid categories. Those fragments survive even now in oral traditions, proverbs, and rituals that scholars are still piecing together. So when you stand in that village, clearing drums, rolling like thunder, and a medium moving with gestures beyond ordinary roles, you realize you're looking at a time before fences were built around desire. A time when identity itself could be fluid, mysterious, and sacred. You lean closer to the fire as another story begins. This time, told not by griots, but by outsiders peering in. Foreign eyes watched Mali with fascination, sometimes admiration, and often judgment. Moroccan envoys, Arab travelers, and later European explorers scribbled down what they saw, leaving records that feel like windows, but also like mirrors warped by bias. You have to squint carefully to separate truth from exaggeration. Take Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler who wandered into Mali in the 14th century. He marveled at the empire's order, its wealth, and the respect shown to scholars. But he also scolded what he considered lax morality. He was shocked by the way women move freely in public, and he frowned at the warmth between men. His outrage, written in ink, tells you more about his expectations than about Mali itself. After all, people rarely complain loudly about things that don't exist. His words, though, dripping with disapproval, are hints that bonds and freedoms thrived in ways outsiders couldn't square with their own codes. Centuries later, European explorers arrived with notebooks ready to describe Africa as they imagined it, primitive or exotic, depending on their mood. Some were astonished by Timbuktu's libraries, which contradicted the myth of a continent without books. Others lingered on descriptions of social customs, filtering them through their own Victorian lenses. If they saw two men sharing a bed on a caravan journey, they labeled it as savagery or scandal, unable to imagine intimacy without their cultural baggage. Isn't it telling how often reports reveal more about the observer than the observed? Moroccan conquerors in the late 16th century brought another layer of scrutiny. After they invaded and weakened Mali, their chroniclers mocked local customs as proof of the empire's decline. When power shifts, so does the narrative. Practices once accepted in silence became painted as symbols of moral failure. The conquerors weren't only seizing gold, they were rewriting the story to cast themselves as saviors of morality. It's a tactic still familiar. Today, condemn the conquered not only with swords, but with shame. Yet even in their condemnations, foreign accounts preserve slivers of truth. A note about affectionate greetings, a complaint about dancers blurring gender roles, a shocked description of public ease. All of these are accidental confirmations that such behaviors existed. Outsiders couldn't resist recording what surprised them, and those surprises are the cracks where hidden histories shine through. You might compare it to a tourist review online. Someone writes angrily about the noise in a local cafe, and without meaning to, they confirm the cafe was lively, popular, and worth visiting. The critique carries the evidence within it. Mali's chroniclers did the same. Their outrage is history's breadcrumb trail. These foreign accounts also shaped how later generations understood Mali. European scholars in the 19th century, digging through Arabic manuscripts, repeated Ibn Battuta's complaints and Moroccan criticisms without questioning the biases. Slowly, the image of Mali as a land of wealth but questionable morals took root. Rarely did anyone stop to ask, what if the locals didn't see it as questionable at all? What if they were simply living in ways outsiders couldn't categorize? For the hidden networks of queer Malians, foreign attention was a double-edged sword. On one side, it preserved a record that proves their existence. On the other, it amplified the voices of those who condemned them. Imagine living a quiet life only to have a stranger's diary centuries later define your entire community. That's the strange fate of Mali's untold histories remembered, but through the eyes of those who judged. So as you sit listening to these foreign voices echo across time, you realize they tell a story, both valuable and flawed. They saw the empire's people through narrow lenses, but in their shock and scorn, they left behind the very proof that love and identity flowed more freely than their pens wanted to admit. The echoes of the Mali Empire don't vanish when the drums stop. They linger, carried forward by colonial laws and modern politics. And here's the final hook. What began as whispers in royal courts and hidden gestures in markets eventually collided with European rulebooks that tried to erase centuries of complexity in one sweep of the pen. Imagine standing at the edge of the 19th century, watching French administrators arrive with their uniforms and paperwork, determined to sort human behavior into neat boxes that never quite fit. Colonial powers brought with them not just guns and trade agreements, but also imported morality. They absorbed earlier condemnations from Arab chroniclers and magnified them with their own Victorian anxieties. Suddenly, what had once been managed quietly sermons here, small punishments there, was criminalized in rigid codes. French colonial law banned same-sex intimacy, outright turning private lives into official offenses. Isn't it strange how 1,000 years of adaptation could be overturned by a law copied from Paris courtrooms that knew nothing of Niger riverbanks or Timbuktu marketplaces? This shift wasn't just legal. It rewired memory. Older traditions that had tolerated fluidity slipped further underground, while colonial officials promoted the idea that African societies had always been rigid. They erased contradictions, painted the past as a blank slate, and claimed they were bringing civilization. In truth, they were erasing civilizations already rich with their own negotiations of love, desire, and belief. You've probably seen the same trick elsewhere when someone rewrites history to make themselves the hero. Colonial rule was a masterclass in that tactic. The weight of these laws didn't vanish with independence. Many African nations inherited colonial penal codes, wholesale carrying forward restrictions that had more to do with French or British anxieties than with their own histories. Mali was no exception. By the mid-20th century, stories of companionship-coded poetry and spirit medium rituals had been buried under a legal system that claimed to speak for morality while actually speaking for empire. Isn't it heartbreaking how the aftershocks of conquest echo long after the conquerors are gone, and yet survival continued? Just as attendants in palaces once leaned close under torchlight, and merchants once signaled interest in busy bazaars, modern Malians carved out their own quiet networks. The methods changed, different meeting spots, different slang, but the pattern of resilience remained. Desire doesn't vanish, it adapts. Think about how people today still find ways to connect even under watchful governments. History repeats in whispers. Today, when scholars dig into Timbuktu's manuscripts or listen to Griot's tales, they recover fragments of this hidden past. They see that the Mali Empire was never a simple tale of gold and glory, nor a one-dimensional story of piety. It was layered law and loophole sermon, and song condemnation, and affection, survival, and silence. By piecing those fragments together, they remind us that queer history in Africa isn't an imported story. It's woven into the continent's own fabric long before colonial pens tried to stitch it out. And maybe that's the real gift of looking back. As you settle deeper into the quiet of night, you see that the untold history of homosexuality in the Mali Empire isn't just about rules broken or punishments risked. It's about humanity refusing to be erased. It's about bonds formed in palaces and markets and songs and in secret networks, bonds that outlived sermons, survived invasions, and slipped past colonial censors. Those bonds whisper even now, if you're willing to listen, reminding you that love always finds its way, no matter how many walls are built to contain it. Across the Mali Empire, Desire, faith, and survival intertwined in ways rarely written down. Palace whispers, market encounters, coded poetry, and ancient rituals all reveal that human affection flowed more freely than official law admitted. These hidden stories remind you that history is never simple, always layered with silences and secrets. Now let's leave the shadows of forbidden love and step into the daylight, where everyday life and culture shape the rhythm of Mali's golden age. The first sound is not a rooster, not even the chatter of neighbors. It's the slow, rhythmic tap of oars against the Niger River, like a giant heartbeat under the morning haze. That's your hook. The Mali Empire doesn't wake with a whisper. It wakes with a river. You rub your eyes, and before the sun climbs too high, you hear pestles pounding grain in wooden mortars, creating a percussion section that rivals any city alarm clock. Imagine if your daily wake-up call was a mix of water drums, goat bleats, and the faint call to prayer rising from a mud brick mosque. It's chaotic, yes, but it's also the sound of an empire breathing. You step outside into the early glow, and the streets of Niani, the empire's bustling capital, stir with motion. Children trot with calabashes balanced on their heads, heading for the riverbank to fetch water. Women sweep dust from courtyards, creating neat concentric swirls in the sand, almost like giant patterns of art, only to be erased by the day's footprints. Elders already sit beneath shade trees talking politics before the heat makes conversation an effort. The city doesn't need a clock tower. It runs on rhythm, and everyone knows their cue. Look toward the water, and you see dugout canoes gliding across traders from villages upstream, bringing fish reeds or news. The river is more than scenery. It's the empire's main road. Before highways and railways, this watery artery tied kingdoms together, ferrying cola nuts, ivory, and salt as easily as gossip. Do you ever complain about traffic? Picture instead dozens of long canoes maneuvering like a watery parade, each steered by men who read currents as if they were maps inked in blue. The smell of breakfast drifts through the air. Millet porridge simmered with milk, perhaps a sprinkle of honey if fortune allows. A griot clears his throat nearby, ready to remind listeners that their ancestors built this world with courage and cleverness. His voice, low and steady, blends with the pounding mortars, weaving history into the morning like thread into cloth. You realize that here, memory isn't tucked into books. It's sung, chanted, and hammered into rhythm, as unavoidable as the rising sun. Somewhere, a muezzin's call floats over the rooftops, reminding the faithful to turn toward prayer. Islam has been stitched into the empire's fabric for centuries, but local traditions breathe just as strongly. Amulets with Quranic verses sit alongside charms carved from bone. A farmer might bow in the mosque and later sprinkle millet on a shrine for ancestral favor. It's less contradiction, more layering the way one rhythm joins another in a drum ensemble. Men slip into tunics of dyed cotton, women adjust bright head wraps, and children chase goats into side alleys. The hum builds steadily until you realize this is not a lazy dawn. It's a rehearsal for the day's commerce, farming, and negotiations. Even Mansa Musa, the empire's legendary ruler, a century earlier, would have heard mornings like this, though perhaps with a little more gold dusting his floors. His pilgrimage to Mecca became legend, but he too relied on the same daily rhythm of boats, mortars, and prayer to anchor his rule. You stand still, letting the dust settle on your sandals, and every sound fits like instruments in an orchestra: canoes, slapping water pestles, pounding grain goats, bleating elders, debating griots, chanting the call to prayer, threading through it all. The empire may be vast, stretching from forest to desert, but its heartbeat begins here each dawn, scored to the river's unending drum. By the time the morning drums and river songs fade into steady daylight, the empire leans into its real work. Food must grow, fish must be caught, and herds must wander. You follow a narrow path out of the city, and soon the landscape opens into rice fields, glistening like small mirrors. Women bend low, pushing seedlings into wet soil, their skirts tucked high, and their laughter carrying over the water. Their arms move with a rhythm you've already learned, one hand planting the other, brushing mosquitoes away. Ever tried squatting in ankle-deep mud for hours? These women do it daily, and somehow still have the energy to tease each other while working. A little further, you hear a splash. Men balance on narrow canoes, flinging nets into the river with a dramatic swoop, then hauling them back heavy with tilapia catfish, or sometimes just mud and reeds. Fishing isn't only food, it's timing, patience, and reading the water like a text you've memorized. A missed throw means an empty pot, and you can bet a wife waiting on shore will have sharp words if the nets come back light. The river doesn't forgive clumsiness, but when it rewards, it does so generously. On drier land, dust swirls around herders steering long-horned cattle across the Sahel. Their silhouettes look almost like moving sculptures, men and boys walking beside animals with horns curved like crescents against the sky. Herding means constant motion, chasing greener pastures before grass withers, guarding calves against thieves or wild predators, listening to the sky for rain that might or might not come. One elder chuckles, telling you that cattle are like children, too quiet, and you know trouble is brewing. You might laugh, but his eyes stay serious because a family's entire wealth could be tied up in those hooves. This mixed rice fish cattle is not just about diet, it's about survival in a landscape that shifts with seasons. The Niger swells and shrinks, sometimes generous, sometimes stingy. Rainy season turns paths to mud, while dry season cracks the soil into puzzle pieces. Everyone must adapt or go hungry. Isn't it strange how we complain when the Wi-Fi drops for 5 minutes, while here families recalibrate entire months around the sky's mood swings? The empire's rulers understood this delicate balance. Taxes weren't just taken in coins or gold dust, but often in grain fish or livestock. A village might owe rice shipments, another might contribute cattle or dried fish. This wasn't abstract bookkeeping, it was the empire's dinner table scaled up. Soldiers marching, scholars studying, even merchants preparing for caravan journeys all depended on these steady flows of food. Without rice-husked nets thrown and herds watered, even the richest gold mines would feel hollow. And don't forget the seasonal festivals. Harvest wasn't just a relief, it was a celebration. Families pounded drums, danced in courtyards, and thanked ancestors and spirits for keeping the balance intact. You can almost hear the stomping feet and smell the roasted fish sizzling over clay stoves, laughter rolling out under the wide Sahel sky. Farming, fishing, and herding weren't dull routines. They were stories in motion, rituals that bound generations together. So when you glance back toward Niani, where the morning began with oars and prayer, you now understand what powers those sounds: rice paddies, glimmering nets rising from the river, cattle hooves thudding in the dust. The empire doesn't just live off its gold. It lives off the stubborn rhythm of people who coax meals from fields, rivers, and savanna. The path back into town leads you straight to a courtyard where sparks fly from an iron forge, and the sound of a hammer on metal rings sharper than any drum. Blacksmiths called numu, are at work, their faces slick with sweat, shaping plow tips, knives, and jewelry. You lean closer and realize they aren't just craftsmen, they're gatekeepers of secrets. Generations pass down techniques like family heirlooms guarded as closely as recipes in your grandmother's kitchen. Ever tried making something from scratch that could either feed a family or cut a tree? Here, every blow of the hammer could change a household's fortune. But it's not just iron. Stroll a little further, and you'll see dyers stirring vats of indigo, pulling out cloth so blue it almost glows in the sun. Women slap the fabric against stones, the dye staining their hands a shade that lingers for days. Imagine scrolling through online shops. Today, back then, this brilliant indigo was a statement piece, a sign of wealth taste, and sometimes even spiritual protection. A trader might show up in desert robes dusted from 1,000 miles of travel, but if his sash gleamed deep blue, everyone knew he had spent good coin in Mali's dye pits. Leather workers shape sandals, belts, and satchels. Their tools simple, but their craft refined. The smell of tanned hides mingles with smoke, sharp enough to wrinkle your nose but rich with purpose. These artisans supply not only locals, but also caravans crossing to North Africa. Think of them as the design houses of their time, except instead of logos and billboards, their reputation travels strapped on camel saddles and soldier belts. And then, of course, there are the griots, the bards, historians and musicians whose words weigh as much as any gold nugget. One griot sits under a baobab tree plucking a kora's strings while reciting tales of Sundiata Keita, the empire's founder. His voice slides between melody and memory, each phrase reminding listeners who they are and where they came from. Can you imagine your entire community history carried not in books, but in the lungs of a performer? Forget Wikipedia. This is living memory, sung with authority, and missing a performance might mean missing a page of your people's story. Artisans belong to hereditary castes, and their status is complex. Some villagers revere blacksmiths for their near-magical command of fire and metal. Others keep a wary distance, suspecting too much power in those skills. Griots are both indispensable and slightly feared praise singers when you need honor-sharp-tongued critics when you offend them. To hire a griot at your wedding is like hiring a celebrity MC today, except with the added risk that if you underpay, he might roast your family in verse for generations. This world of crafts pulses with invisible threads. Tools keep farms running, cloth keeps status shining leather, keeps caravans walking, and songs keep history alive. You may not see their names etched in stone, but without these artisans, the empire's fields, markets, and courts would crumble. Back on the street, a boy rushes past, balancing a newly dyed cloth on his head, the indigo dripping trails behind him, like little stars splashed on dust. Sparks crackle again from the blacksmith's forge, and the griot's voice carries over rooftops. The empire hums not only with rice and cattle, but with these hands hammering, weaving, dyeing, singing, each gesture a craft, a thread in Mali's vast and colorful weave. Step into the plaza on market day, and you're hit with a hook stronger than any drumbeat. The empire's veins don't pulse with gold alone. They surge with salt, cola, and chatter thick as the dust in the air. You weave through stalls where pyramids of Hagaza salt blocks glint like pale bricks. So valuable, people treat them like treasure chests. Next to them lies gold dust in tiny leather pouches, exchanged carefully on scales where every grain can tilt a deal. Ever thought of paying your rent in salt slabs? Here it wouldn't just be accepted, it might even be preferred. Vendors call out in languages braided together, Bambara Soninka, Fulani, Arabic, because markets are where tongues mingle as easily as spices. One merchant haggles over dried fish. Another shouts prices for kola nuts shipped up from the forests to keep caravans awake on endless marches. You sniff roasted millet cakes, hear the laughter of children chasing each other between goats and baskets, and catch the sing-song rhythm of bargaining that could double as a drum performance. Look closer at the traders who've come from across deserts, their camels tethered nearby tails, swishing lazily. Berbers with long blue veils bring copper and cloth Tuareg with silver jewelry gleaming on their arms, and Arab merchants offering glass beads and manuscripts. Each has a story of sandstorm-survived wells found and miles counted by the stars. One caravan leader leans on his staff, boasting that he has crossed from Sigil Masa without losing a single camel. You roll your eyes at his swagger, but deep down, you know such endurance deserves applause. Salt and gold form the backbone of this buzzing scene, yet so do ideas. Between haggles, news spreads, whose son joined a caravan, which town has new tax rules, whether a scholar is arriving from Timbuktu with fresh teachings. Markets are Mali's social media feeds only without the scroll. You stand in the crowd and updates find you. Someone whispers about a distant sultan's war, another about rainfall to the south, and by the time you leave, you're caught up with empire-wide news. The bargaining is fierce, but never silent. Women dominate many stalls, their voices sharp and clever, refusing to be cheated. A customer groans at a price, and the vendor fires back with a joke about his stingy ancestors. The crowd laughs, the price softens, and the deal is struck. Negotiation here is performance, a kind of theater where wit carries weight alongside coins and scales. Would you be brave enough to haggle in public with an audience ready to laugh at your mistakes? Even in the chaos, there's order. Scales are inspected, measures checked, and disputes settled quickly because trust makes trade possible. A merchant's reputation can travel farther than his caravan cheat once, and griots might etch your dishonor into song. Honor, like gold dust, is fragile but precious. The sun climbs, shadows shrink, and the plaza swells until you can barely move. Drums beat not just for music, but for signaling time to pray, time to pack, time to guard goods before thieves blend into the crowd. But even the risk of pickpockets can't dull the energy. This is the empire alive, a crossroads where desert salt forest, Kola River fish, and Sahel grain all crash together in an endless swirl of dust, laughter, and deals. By the time market stalls quiet, the salt blocks are stacked away, you step into the shaded calm of a household compound. The sun has baked the clay walls warm, and the air carries the smell of millet porridge simmering with a hint of baobab leaves. Inside, family life unfolds in patterns that seem both ordinary and majestic. A grandmother crouches to stir a pot, children run circles with wooden toys, and men chat lazily under a tree, while women balance calabashes of water with effortless grace. The empire may stretch for hundreds of miles, but its heartbeat is right here behind these walls. Food is more than fuel, it's community. A bowl of too thick porridge made from millet or sorghum is dipped into by several hands, at once, each person using a piece to scoop sauce of groundnuts or fish. No plates, no silverware, just a circle of relatives leaning in, talking between bites. You think of your own dinner table, each person with a separate plate, scrolling phones between mouthfuls, and you realize how much closer the meal feels here. Hunger is satisfied, yes, but so is belonging. Step into the women's kitchen space, and you'll see order hidden in apparent chaos. Firewood stacked carefully clay jars, sealed with cloth to keep out pests. Spices tucked into gourds and ladles carved smooth from years of stirring. Women control the flow of ingredients the way merchants control caravans, stretching grain when guests arrive, saving dried fish for leaner months, adjusting recipes to keep children fed when harvests disappoint. This is economic planning disguised as stew. Marriage ties link households into webs of obligation. A young bride enters the compound with songs, gifts, and a dowry that might include cloth jewelry or livestock. She brings not only her labor, but also her family's connections, reinforcing alliances that can decide the flow of land or trade. Her status grows with children, especially sons. Though daughters are cherished for the alliances their marriages will one day forge. Family here is not a private bubble, but a public network, every meal and marriage woven into politics as much as affection. Even the architecture tells stories. Homes circle around shared courtyards, where goats wander freely and neighbors drift in with greetings. Mud walls keep interiors cool, while flat rooftops double as storage and sleeping areas on hot nights. You glance upward and see mats rolled neatly ready for evening, when families will climb up to catch breezes under the stars. Isn't it funny how we chase rooftop experiences in trendy cities today, while here it's just the most practical way to survive a sweltering night? Children swirl everywhere, half chores and half play. A boy carries firewood twice his size, wobbling dramatically as his sisters tease him. A girl balances a jar of water and practices walking steadily, knowing one day she'll do the same for her own household. Lessons are practical, woven into daily life. Reading might come later in Quranic schools, but first you learn to keep goats from wandering into millet fields. If you've ever had chores as a child, you'll recognize the same sighs and rolled eyes, except here slacking could actually starve the family. As dusk stretches, you sit back against the wall, watching the household hum, men preparing for evening prayers, women smoothing cloth for tomorrow's market children, drowsy from games and chores. The compound glows with the warmth of food, laughter, and shared responsibility. Outside, traders may tally gold dust, scholars may recite law, but inside these mud walls, the real foundation of the empire is kept steady. One pot of porridge, one marriage, tie one bedtime story at a time. When the courtyard quiets and the cooking smoke thins, you slip into the shade of a mosque's mud walls, where voices of boys echo softly, reciting verses of the Quran in sing-song rhythm. A teacher sits cross-legged, a wooden board across his knees, ink stained from verses carefully copied. You realize this is more than school. It's how knowledge itself travels. Children memorize line by line, rocking gently, as if movement helps the words settle deeper. Have you ever tried memorizing something by heart instead of looking it up? Here at Survival, books are rare. Memory is wealth. Step into Timbuktu in your imagination, where whole neighborhoods buzz with scholars and scribes. You pass doorways where men lean over manuscripts of astronomy, law, poetry, and medicine. Libraries grow in courtyards protected as fiercely as gold. The great Sankore Mosque isn't only a place of prayer. It's a university where ideas travel farther than caravans. Students from across the Sahel sit in circles, arguing points of Islamic law, then wander into alleys where merchants debate grain prices. Religion, economy, and learning blur into one tapestry. Faith itself threads through daily rhythm. 5 times a day, the muezzin's call arcs over rooftops, and you watch families pause, washing hands and feet, rolling out mats, turning toward Mecca. Yet Islam isn't the only melody here. Older traditions still hum beneath. Hunters wear leather charms, inscribed with verses, women sprinkle water at ancestor shrines, and rituals for rain or fertility persist alongside Quranic recitation. To modern ears it might sound contradictory, but hear its harmony, one prayer layered on another, like instruments in a single song. Law anchors it all. A qadi or judge sits beneath the tree robes, flowing hearing disputes between farmers, traders, and families. He listens carefully, weighing Quranic law, local custom, and practical fairness. One man complains his neighbor's goats ate his millet. Another insists a caravan partner shorted him on salt. Witnesses testify, contracts are produced, and the qadi strokes his beard before declaring judgment. Justice isn't perfect. When is it ever? But the system binds the empire together with more than soldiers. Do you think your neighborhood disputes could be settled under a tree with everyone watching? Some rulers leaned heavily on scholars. Mansa Musa himself, famed for showering Cairo with gold on his pilgrimage, filled Timbuktu with judges and clerics. He knew wealth alone didn't secure power. Legitimacy came through learning and law. By supporting Islamic scholars, he framed his rule not only as rich, but righteous. Later emperors followed, though, with varying enthusiasm. You can imagine the tension between a warrior eager for conquest and a scholar reminding him of law's boundaries. Learning shaped ordinary people too. A boy who learned to read Arabic gained status far beyond his village. A merchant who mastered contracts could expand his reach. A family with a child trained in the Quran earned prestige that carried into marriage negotiations. Knowledge wasn't abstract. It bought respect, opened doors, softened disputes, and unlike gold once in your head, it couldn't be taxed or stolen. The courtyard around you grows busier. Students pack up their boards, shaking excess sand off ink, while women pass with baskets of food. The mosque walls cast long shadows, and you feel how deeply knowledge, faith, and justice are stitched into daily life. The empire doesn't just live by rice and salt. It lives by verses remembered, laws debated, and prayers whispered at dawn and dusk. The road begins as a ribbon of dust and ends in starlight, and you step onto it with a waterskin, a grin you don't entirely trust, and a guide who can read dunes the way you read your own name. Camels grunt. Wooden ferries bump the bank, and someone taps a drum once just to say we're leaving without wasting breath. If markets are the empire's chatter roads, and rivers are its deep voice, slow and certain, carrying salt out and stories back. You start by water, because the Niger is a teacher with patient shoulders. Boatmen push long poles against the current pirogues, skim along reed beds, and bundles of dried fish ride low tide neatly like sleeping crocodiles. A ferryman nods toward a narrow channel only he trusts, and the canoe slips between sandbars with the confidence of someone who has argued with this river since childhood. You feel the current tug at your ankles, and the sun press your shoulders, and suddenly the map in your head rearranges itself around water. Ever tried to navigate a city by listening instead of looking? Hear the slap of oar against river tells you where you are. At a landing upriver, a caravan waits, camels already chewing their sideways stares, unimpressed by all human plans. Bales of Takhaza salt are stacked like pale bricks cords biting into the load. Kola nuts from the forest sit in baskets ready to earn their keep mile after mile. A woman tightens a head wrap. A boy checks a tether, and the guide Tuareg Vale pulled high squints at the sky, not to pose, but to read the light. He points we move when the heat stops thinking. Dusk is a kind of door. When the world cools, you rise into the Sahel, that long conversation between grass and sand. The first hours are always chatty traders, retelling the same jokes from market day gossip, drifting as easily as dust. Someone swears a certain Qadi can settle a dispute with a glance. Someone else claims a scholar from Timbuktu has written a treatise so elegant it makes creditors forgive a little interest. You learn quickly that rest stops are half canteen, half news network. If you could bottle the information exchanged at one well, you could run a city. Then the dunes begin to breathe. The guide reads them like a book with raised letters, the way a crest slumps after wind tells direction. The temperature of sand underfoot hints at recent weather. The position of Orion at dawn confirms velocity. He listens to silence, the way city people listen to traffic. If it changes, something is wrong. Do you trust your GPS more than your gut? You ask yourself, feeling a twinge of envy for a man who calibrates by stars and grit. Night travel isn't just poetic, it's practical. Camels move better when the heat relaxes its fist and water skins stretch their mercy. The caravan strings itself into a slow necklace of bells and footfalls. You try matching your breath to a camel's rolling stride and discover the trick stop fighting the sway. Somewhere ahead, the scout drops from his saddle to check a track, that faint arrow of footprints bending toward a shallow pan. Gazelle, someone whispers. Also thieves, another answers, and the pace tightens without comment. Security is rhythm. Bunch up here, spread there, keep the quiet constant. Oases arrive like well-told jokes just when patience thins. Date palms throw lacework shadows, and the ground drinks spill less greedily. The well is civilization, a circle of stone. Etiquette clicks into place, water for animals first, then for people. Newcomers announce from a polite distance. No one hoards shade. A girl from the nearby settlement arrives with flatbread and a grin that says, business is brisk. News a merchant asks, and she delivers it like a bard with crumbs. Bandits seen 2 days north, a new tax downstream. A marriage between trading families that will lower the price of cloth if you're patient. Would your own road trips be better if the gas station attendant recited poetry with the fuel? When the path crosses stony ground, sound shifts from hush to crunch. You pass cairns that mark older travelers' careful arithmetic. This many piles to the next, well double that to the ridge. The guide hums not to entertain, but to pace the steps. A second in command counts under his breath, not sheep, but distances, a human odometer that never needs winding. At midday, you crouch in a patch of shade that is more idea than reality, and a woman unwraps kola nuts like a magician producing bright coins. A nibble sharpens tongues and feet. For a moment, you understand why caravans treat kola like portable courage. Not all miles belong to sand. Floodplains demand ferries again, or a long detour that only experience justifies. Boatmen hire out their boats, and two economies shake hands without fuss. You help shove a pirogue into water that looks sleepy until it decides not to be. The ferryman leans into his pole, talking to the current as if it were a stubborn friend. Halfway across, he points to a ripple where hippos sometimes choose to be unhelpful, and your group paddles wider with the quiet speed of people who have learned from other people's bad days. Way stations in towns feel like theater after so much horizon. Caravanserais fold you into courtyards where walls remember 1,000 temporary lives. Saddles are stacked Hooves get washed, scales come out, and arguments about weight and measure resume the way a favorite song picks up on the chorus. A scribe squats with his reed pen to check a contract ink drying in air so warm it could bake bread. You catch the smell of indigo and leather from Section 3, a callback dressed as perfume, and realize how roads stitch crafts to markets, markets to scholars, scholars to law. Stories travel faster than camels. At one stop, an old man remembers the day Mansa Musa's pilgrimage passed through lands to the north gold glittering like a low sunrise. At another, a younger merchant repeats Ibn Battuta's comments on hospitality, agreeing with some rolling his eyes at others, because even a traveler's critique is cargo to be traded. You don't need to swear to every detail. The point is, the pulse roads are rumor's favorite shoes. Hazards are part of the bargain. A sudden wind erases a morning's footprints as efficiently as a lazy scribe blotting a page. Someone coughs, and a healer pushes a tisane toward him, a recipe that tastes like Section 9's court testimony would if you could boil it, structured, soothing, slightly bitter, in a reassuring way. The guide changes course by a finger width and saves an hour. Nobody applauds, but everyone sleeps easier on the far side of the ridge. By late season, the Empire's logistics look almost casual. Bales slide from camel to storeroom without drama. Salt becomes silver, becomes cloth, becomes stories, and the road swallows its own tracks. You look back only once, because travelers learn to keep their eyes where their feet will be. Ahead, the river opens again, broad and brown and patient, and the ferryman taps his pole in greeting like a drummer recognizing a friend across a crowd. The water remembers you, even if the dunes do not, and that feels like a promise you can carry without adding weight to your pack. By the time the ferryman's pole stops tapping and the caravan dust settles, what rises first isn't trade or law, but sound of thin strings twang testing the night. A gourd soft pulse, a voice clearing its path through hush. You ease into a circle of lamplight, where a jelly griot rests a lute across his lap, the wood polished by decades of stories. He plucks a pattern, walks, not runs, and the courtyard leans forward with you. Memory here has a melody, and you can hum along, even if you don't know the words yet. The instrument is small, skin-topped, with a neck like a slender path, an Ngoni ancestor to a family of West African lutes, and to distant relatives you'd recognize in a different hemisphere. Across from him, a second musician shakes iron rattles, with wrist flicks precise enough to measure time. A balafon waits in the wings, a wooden xylophone over buzzing gourds, ready to enter, like a bright river over stones. When its mallets finally speak, each note carries a halo from the Merleton membranes beneath that bee-like shimmer you keep trying to find in modern synths. The jelly announces a lineage in a low register names that thicken the air: Sundiata, Keita, son of Sogolon, Bala Faseke, the master of the early balafon, patrons whose generosity braided this very performance into the fabric of the town. He isn't improvising flattery so much as negotiating memory, reminding everyone where honor sits and how it travels. Ever had a friend who can roast you affectionately and somehow make you proud griots, perfected that art long before comment sections? Around you, indigo cloth from the dye pits of Section 3 drinks the lamplight, turning deep blue into midnight. A hunter's jacket carries charm-stitched tight leather packets inked with Quranic verses from Section 6, a meeting of faith and craft that feels less like a compromise and more like a duet. You trace the mud-painted patterns on a woman's wrapper, Bogolan Fini mud cloth, its earthy triangles and lines, speaking a vocabulary of seasons hunts and careful thresholds. Ask quietly, and she'll tell you which motifs her mother reserved for rites of passage, which she wears today simply because they make her feel correctly arranged in the world. Hair becomes architecture. Braids interlace like maps of irrigation channels. Threads wrap strands into sleek ridges. Cowries click softly when she turns her head. The styling session this afternoon lasted hours, not vanity, so much as community time news exchanged braid by braid. If a child sat still long enough, an elder traced a future path just by parting hair sideways to show stubbornness, straight to invite steadiness, a star at the crown, because why not carry constellations with you? Gold glints at wrists and ears, thin hoops, coiled. Bangles, hammered discs that catch every candle flicker. Some pieces traveled with caravans. Others were smelted by a cousin who learned from a Numu smith. Jewelry talks. A stack of bracelets might say, I married into good traders, a heavier neckpiece my aunt is generous a discreet ring. I know when to shine and when to shade. You try not to stare and fail, which is fine. Adornment is part of the conversation, not the punctuation. The jelly story swells. He traces Sundiata's exile like a road you can still walk tonight, folds in the prophecy of a crippled boy who adds a drummer's roll for the day Karina's dust rose under hooves. He pauses just long enough for someone to press a coin or a strip of cloth into his hand patronage glowing in public, so the social math adds up. Do you tip the street musician when they soundtrack your walk home? Here, generosity is not optional. It's a public promise that you understand how memory gets maintained. Women answer the story with ululations that ring like silver hoops. Then the circle relaxes into a song everyone knows. Call and response braids the courtyard together, and you find a place for your voice without stealing space. A grandmother leans toward you. Let the lead sit on top. You grin and obey. Rhythm is a civic duty, and the beat belongs to the patient. Fashion turns kinetic. Indigo wrappers flare on turns. Bead belts chirp, and anklets set their own metronome. You notice how movement edits fabric. A wrapper too tight won't survive this step pattern. Sandals too loose announce themselves before your feet do. Dance is informal adjudication clothes, proven they deserve the name fit. Somewhere, a weaver watches committing corrections for tomorrow's warp because catwalks are fine, but the courtyard never lies. Costume and status have their wit. A youth arrives wearing a new turban fold he swears he invented. A jelly grins and references a prince who wore it before his grandfather's beard came in. A hunter adjusts the amulet on his chest, not to flex, but to align. A girl's henna spirals glisten at her fingertips, fading calendars that will outlast this week's gossip, but not the next. If you had to wear your calendar, what would the pattern say? Deadlines? Hopes are places where you promise to say less. Some nights the balafon takes over, turning the space into geometry you can hear. Patterns switch between 2s and 3s like braided reeds, and your body starts solving for X by moving. A boy tries to hide his pride when he nails a tricky cross rhythm. His aunt pretends not to notice, then throws him a praise name that sticks. Praise names are more than applause. They're portable biographies. Carry one from a respected mouth and doors open the way knots loosen with water. Stories aren't all royal. A clever trickster gets his turn outwitting a greedy butcher with nothing but a calabash and gall. A widow bargains so well at market, the scales blush themselves true. A caravan guide misreads the wind and is saved by a girl who counts dunes like beads. Humor here trims fear down to size. You laugh not to forget hardship, but to keep it negotiable. You've done that too. Told a joke before a presentation, so your heart stops pounding long enough to stand up straight. Between songs, someone slides a Cora-like harp lute into view, a tall gourd long neck, many strings. Older folks nod. It's not the center of tonight's set, but its rippling arpeggios sound like moonlight poured carefully into a bowl. Instruments migrate, names evolve, but the conversation stays wood skin string story. If you listen long enough, you'll hear how a century can be measured in tunings. The night keeps adding small, bright things. A vendor materializes with fried millet cakes and a confidence that says, yes, you're hungry, don't argue. A scholar in a pale robe smiles at a line in the epic that doubles as a legal proverb and files it away for tomorrow's hearing. A dyer inspects a sleeve. In lamplight pleased, the indigo held true. Sections 3 and 6. Hum quietly at the edges, craft and law, eavesdropping on music, because nothing here lives alone. When the jelly softens his strings, conversation resumes, as if breath had been held only for melody. A mother practices dance step with her toddler, tiny heels, tapping the earth's patient drum. A hunter leans his head to catch a new verse's contour, figuring out where to fit it into his own swagger. You rub indigo dust between your fingers and realize it never really leaves. It just learns to live on the skin without apology. Tonight has been a lesson in how style isn't decoration. It's a memory device, a social instrument, a daily treaty between beauty and use. Harmattan arrives like a whisper that dries everything it touches. Lips, laundry, prayers in the morning air. You wake to a sky the color of ground cinnamon, the sun dimmed to a pale coin by Saharan dust. Water jars wear damp collars where yesterday's fill line sat, and every clay pot becomes a small refrigerator by simple evaporation. You rub a smear of shea butter into your knuckles, the good nutty kind pounded by a cousin upriver, and decide the wind may rule the sky, but it doesn't have to crack your hands. Have you ever felt a season teach you new ways to move? Harmattan's first lesson is slower breathing and covered heads. Food listens to the season too. Millet and sorghum wait in granaries, lifted off the ground on stout posts, each bin capped like a little helmet against thieves with paws and thieves with hands. The family's grain counts live in more places than a ledger. A grandmother's memory, a notch on a beam, the way the floor feels lighter underfoot. You measure portions with respect for the calendar, not the appetite. On the wall hangs a woven fan for winnowing. On the shelf sit gourds of dried okra groundnut paste, wrapped like thick paper smoked fish, tucked away for days when the market shrugs. Remember the kitchen logistics from the household compound. Hear the math scales to months. When rain finally drums the roofs, the world flips its script, paths turn to brown rivers. The Niger heaves against its banks like a restless sleeper. Fields greedily swallow water until frogs celebrate like percussionists who've been waiting backstage. Rain is blessing, yes, but also a dare. Houses need quick hands to patch leaks. Footpaths demand detours. Even the ferryman from Section 7 might think twice about. A trader lifts her skirt. Hem laughs and chooses the long way, because dignity survives better with dry goods. The season brings life in its problems. Mosquitoes assemble like uninvited brass sections, and fevers follow the drum line. Healers step forward with bundles that look like tiny forests, neem leaves, bitter enough to scold a tongue hibiscus calixes, you call it sorrel, or bissap. later to cool a hothead baobab pulp whisked into a tart drink that slides right into thirst's empty chair. A curer checks your pulse and your story, because bodies here belong to families, fields, and rumors. Did you work too long in the rice water? Did grief sit on your chest after the market argument? You answer honestly. It saves time. Midwives still make the most complicated work look inevitable. She arrives wearing a cloth you recognize from last night's song, Circle Indigo from Section 3. Doesn't hide from duty hands scrubbed with ash and water until they creak. She asks for boiled linens, a calabash of warm oil. The room's quiet. Breathing becomes a chorus. Aunties recite a verse. A girl fans smoke away from the mother's face. Someone knots a ribbon at the bedpost with that old promise of distraction. A healthy cry afterward is not just joy. It's accounting one more heartbeat in the household's arithmetic. Amulets catch the lamplight, little leather packets stitched neatly, each with a sliver of Quranic writing, folded inside sometimes a sliver of iron from a Numu smith. To remember heat's discipline, hunters add theirs to jackets. Mothers tie them to babies' wrists. A traveler tucks one into a turban fold before the road tilts toward dunes. You remember Section 6's courtyard of recitation. Those verses don't stay on boards. They go out into muddy lanes and windy ferries, stitched onto daily life like quiet advice. Water itself needs strategy. Cattle drink first when herders arrive dust gray at dusk. People second. Plants only if the sky's patience fails. Wells have etiquette: line up in shade. Announce yourself. Share the rope if calluses nod approval. A boy reaches for the bucket too fast, and an elder taps the rim lightly. Son, let the rope stop dancing. You smile. Every community invents its own speed limits. Sickness takes a lot of names. Stomach knots after unboiled water become empacho, by another culture's word. But here, it's just the belly's bad thinking, cured with mint ginger and thyme. Fevers sometimes wear the river's grin. A healer places a cool cloth scented with lemongrass and murmurs a verse half lullaby, half housekeeping. Serious cases travel to a Qadi's courtyard where law meets medicine. Witnesses swear whether foul play touched the pot or whether a neighbor's goat dunged near the well. Justice under a tree can be surprisingly good at contact tracing. Mid-dry season Harmattan's dryness at least grants clear nights that become clinics for breath and bone. People sleep on rooftops where stars offer entertainment and weather reports. If your cough eases under starlight, that's a diagnosis too. A grandmother rubs she on a grandson's chest in slow circles. Someone cracks a joke to keep the room from tightening. You learn that bedside manner might have been invented long before anyone named it. If you've ever been calmed by a voice that wasn't trying to be profound, just steady, you know the medicine. Food becomes pharmacy without announcing itself. Baobab leaf sauce thickens into a green that tastes like strength. Tiger nuts chew sweet and sly. Honey hovers as a spoonful of bribery for bitter herbs. During lean weeks, women stretch porridge with gratitude and ground nuts. And men who brag at market learn humility in front of a simmering pot. Dried fish slips into sauces the way good advice slips into a conversation quietly. And suddenly, everything holds together. Work rhythms map onto health like shade maps onto a courtyard. Farmers start earlier, stop harder, and plan naps with the seriousness of a contract. Herders angle their routes to chase breezes you can't see on a map. Fishermen respect the river's moods. If hippos choose, that channel move the net and keep your story short. A caravan captain counts footsteps by taste of the air. Too much dust in the mouth means slow the camels. Too much silence tightened the line. The body takes notes even when the head claims not to. When trouble grows taller than herbs, solidarities go to work. A neighbor's roof dips under rain too many nights, and men show up with reeds and rope. A widow's granary empties before harvest, and someone's ledger forgets a debt until the next moon. A healer's fee slides lower if a child's eyes are too wide. Griots from Section 8 archive these rescues in verses that sound like jokes until you listen twice. Pride survives better when praise is phrased like a story. The seasons revise your kit, the way caravans revise their loads. In Harmattan, you carry a scarf, extra water, a small pot of she. In rains, you keep sandals, the cave in mud, a gourd lid that laughs at leaks, and a courteous relationship with every ferry pole in town. You learn where shade lands at noon, which alley keeps wind without dust, which vendor slips hibiscus into your hand when your forehead looks too shiny. By now you've realized health isn't a clinic. It's a chorus herbs law prayer, neighborliness, all tuned to the climate's key. Dawn returns with dust's soft paw, or with a roof-drumming rain, and the compound adjusts without speeches. A child coughs once then twice. Someone reaches for a gourd, someone else for a verse. The mortar begins its measured thunder in the kitchen. The day steps into its own pace, as if the body of the town had stretched, yawned, and remembered the dance. You breathe in taste, the season on your tongue, and carry on, because survival here isn't a headline. It's a habit trained by wind water and the hands that refuse to let go. Night pours over the town like a bowl of indigo, and every rooftop becomes a soft-breathing audience waiting for the first drum. You hold your breath with it, because darkness here isn't emptiness. It's a stage the sky sets for people who already know their lines. Lanterns wink awake in courtyards, spice smoke climbs like thin handwriting, and somewhere a child scolds a goat with the confidence of a king. If morning is the empire's heartbeat, night is its memory deciding which stories to wear. The drum that answers is small but confident, a talking drum with strings that pinch pitch into syllables. It calls neighbors by nickname, compliments. A grandmother's braids teases a fisherman whose net famously lost a debate with a hippo. Laughter moves faster than the sound itself. A balafon replies bright wooden notes skipping across the courtyard like flat stones on a calm stretch of Niger, and you feel your shoulders settle into that sleepy ASMR rhythm we both like. Long day, says the groove. Sit. We've got you. Festivals bend the night in different shapes. When Ramadan draws its silver thread across the calendar, you hear the muezzin's evening call spilled on the alleys like cool water. Fasting ends with dates passed palm to palm, milk sipped slow, and trays of rice fragrant with onion and pepper. Someone recites a short verse, the children try to whisper and fail, and an auntie smirks at the cousin who definitely counted minutes wrong this afternoon. After prayers, the slow joy begins. Neighbors feeding neighbors, the gossip, merciful, the jokes tender. You taste the empire's patience on your tongue. Harvest dances carry a different voltage, earthier dusk kissed. Feet test the courtyard first, then commit stamping in patterns learned by ankles before brains. Masks step out from doorways, gleaming wood raffia, shoulders, eyes where shadow does the talking. A hunter's jacket from earlier nights appears again, its leather packets twitching with each beat, as if the amulets approve the tempo. If you tilt your head, you can hear Section 8 grinning. You already know how music burns a trail home through the dark. Feasting follows rhythm, the way a ferry follows the bend inevitably. Calabashes pass like planets in tidy orbits, millet couscous light, as dust fish, stew glossy with oil leaf sauces, tasting green and brave. Someone drops a spicy warning too late, and the table wheezes then laughs. You'll remember the exact sound of spoons against wood because it's the percussion section no one claps for. Every bite has logistics behind it, fields from Section 2 nets from the river salt that walked here on a camel's patient back. Elders steer the talk toward stories that walk farther than people. A jelly lifts the Angoni and slides into Sundiata's exile again, not because listeners forgot, but because memory likes rehearsal. Tonight he pauses in new places, the mother who hid courage in a gourd, the messenger who read hoofprints like Quranic script. He nods toward the qadi by the gate. The judge grins into his sleeve when a proverb about fair scales lands squarely in his lap. Law and legend share a bench without elbowing. You notice how clothes edit the light. Indigo wrappers drink it. White boo-boos hand it back. Jewelry thin, hammered crescents. Coin-bright bangles catches and returns it in tiny comets. Hair carries the day's news. Fresh braids say somebody had time and auntie's loosened ends. Confess we danced more than we planned. Henna spirals glow warm at wrists. A pattern you admired earlier has smudged into tomorrow's rumor, which is exactly how fashion wants to live half message, half meteor. Children perform their small theater. A stick becomes a spear, then a paddle, then a ruler's staff. Alliances form and dissolve over a single gourd lid. The kid, with the loudest laugh, inevitably declares himself tax collector. You grin and move your pouch out of reach, because you've met that official before, in at least 3 time periods. Older kids practice a praise name under their breath, trying it on like a new sandal to see if the heel rubs. If a grandmother blesses it with a chuckle, it will stick. Travelers tilt the night a few degrees. A ferryman tells a story that sounds like a river pretending to be human. A caravan guide contributes a star fact Orion at calendar Venus as rumor trap, and everyone nods like they've always known. A woman from a forest-edge town unwraps cola nuts with magician's flair. A fisherman awards her an honorary net. You watch respect move through the group like a careful animal. No speeches, just space made on a mat. A second ladle in the pot. A joke shared at the right temperature. Sometimes the festival steps outside its own body. A scholar quotes a line about mercy. The drummer answers with a rhythm borrowed from a rain dance, and a leather worker hands that reek of tannin, and genius starts clapping the offbeats until the whole courtyard floats a bit. You remember Section 3's sparks and Section 6's verses, and feel them both in your ribs. Empires love monuments. People prefer grooves. Grooves travel lighter. Between dances, plans get hatched in voices that pretend to be casual. A boat leaves at dawn for an upstream market. A cousin with a steady hand will copy a manuscript page everyone wants. The dyer will try a deeper bath for the cloth you ruined, doing the 2-step badly. The ferryman offers shade on his deck if you bring roasted peanuts. A herder mentions grass higher near the old mound past the acacia. The blacksmith murmurs a new blade could make a friend out of stubborn ground. Tomorrow is getting built with jokes and promises balanced like calabashes on calm heads. A mask circles back, and the courtyard holds its breath. The dancer's feet go quiet for a heartbeat, then land with a thud that folds dust into the drum. Someone's baby startles, and then decides to trust the rhythm. You feel the same choice flash through your chest, fear or sway, and you pick sway because it's what the night keeps offering. The balafon trails a ladder of notes you could climb with closed eyes. Up on the roof, the stars take attendance and find no one missing who shouldn't be. Later, when the lamps shrink to embers, words settle into low tide. A grandmother hums a line that might be a lullaby or a ledger. A boy counts constellations and gives up at 10 satisfied that math has done enough for one day. The drum curls on its side like a tired cat. You stretch out on the roof mat, and the air has that just right temperature that makes even worry drowsy. If you're still listening, the river's old metronome from Section 1 is out there somewhere, tapping the same patient beat it tapped at dawn. The empire doesn't sleep so much as change key, and your breathing slides into the new song without asking permission. Close your eyes and drift along the night air dawn. Oars, mortar rhythms, rice fields, nets, and long-horned herds. Forges sparking indigo cloth, drying markets where salt meets gold, and jokes set prices. Courtyards warm with porridge, prayer, and law. Ferries and caravans stitching towns. Griots tuning memory. Healers, midwives, and seasoned schooling patients. Nights of drums, masks, and soft laughter. You are safe. Breathe slowly. Let their steady courage rock you to sleep and wake carrying their quiet, usable wisdom.